Hi, in this video I'm going to share with you the 7 most useful editing techniques and features in Lightroom, or at least the ones that I find the most useful, and perhaps you will too. Hi there, I'm Keith Mason, and on this channel I share tips and ideas that I have learnt on my photography journey that may help you in your photography journey. The first technique that I use is using filters for local adjustments. Clearly, when you use the basic panel in Lightroom, the adjustments that you make affect the whole of the image, but sometimes you don't want to have a certain adjustment on highlights or shadows apply across the whole of the image, and consequently you can use either graduated filters or radial filters to make local adjustments. And here's a couple of examples. So in this image here, this is an intentional camera movement image of a local beach, and although you can tell that it's a beach, the top part of the image, the sky, is just perhaps a little bit too dark. So I'll use a graduated filter, which I pick here and drag down. If you hold the shift key while you do that, the filter is horizontal, and I'm just going to bring the exposure down a little. Now what that does is that I'm just adjusting that part of the image just using the filter. And I use the same technique using radial filters, but for much more localized edits. So in this image of a woodland with bluebells in that I took recently, you'll see that I've applied radial filters here to darken down the trees a little bit, here to raise the shadows a little bit, here to raise the overall exposure and to add a little bit of additional shadows. And then on this main tree here, I've used 2 radial filters, one to darken the side of the tree that is away from the main light source, and the other side of the tree to emphasize it. And what that does here is it adds a little bit more three-dimensional impact of the tree. So graduated and radial filters are my first technique for emphasizing local adjustments in my images. The second technique that I use in Lightroom a lot is in combination with radial and graduated filters, and that's luminosity. That is luminosity masking. Here is a picture that I shared in the last video that I did, and what came out, if we hit the backspace bar and look at the original RAW file, is that the sky is okay, but the foreground is very, very dark. However, were we to use a radial filter from the bottom to increase the exposure of the land, these nice areas of the sea would also be affected. So what we're trying to do is be able to select specific areas of an image just by the amount of light in a particular region of the image. So to be able to select just the foreground, the dark headland, if we just take a graduated filter, paint over the whole of the bottom of the image, I'm going to come down to where it says range mask, and I turn on the luminescent range mask, and it says show the mask, and you can see everything in the mask is covered red. But I'm just interested in the darker parts of the image, and so if I take the slider from the right and move to the left, you can see that all of a sudden the selection for the mask is much more in the dark parts of the image, and that's fairly well defined. So what I can then do, I can then bring up the exposure, and you can see that while the C, which is not part of the mask, is unaffected as I change the exposure. So now I can bring up the shadows in the in the headland, and probably bring up the contrast. So luminescence masking can be used with a radial filter or a graduated filter, as I've done here, and you can just select certain parts of the image based on the light in it. The third technique that I want to share with you is selecting masks based on color ranges. And in this picture, I have a picture of our young puppy sitting on a red blanket. But if we look at the raw file, it was very dark. So from the raw file, the first thing I'm going to do is obviously bring up the exposure quite a lot. And now we can see the puppy. But actually, to try and focus in on the dog, I actually want to bring the reds of the blanket down a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a graduated filter across most of the image, and I'm going to use colour as a range mask and use the dropper to select the colour of the blanket. And now what I can do, and I can show you how the mask is working, is if I drop the exposure, you'll see that the blanket completely is reduced in exposure, but the dog hasn't changed. So we know that the mask is there and working. But what I want to do is I want to bring the highlights down a little bit and the shadows a little bit and the exposure just a little bit, so that our eye is led towards the dog rather than the blanket. So selecting ranges based on colour can be quite useful at times. So I said I'm going to give you 7 techniques, and I said also that I'll give you a couple of bonuses. So here's the first bonus, and that is how to deal with sunstars in your image. If you've taken a picture like we've done here at Cape Cornwall, you're shooting into the sun, if you close down your f-stop down to f22, you tend to get these rays coming out of the sun, and we've got that here. But the whole horizon here looks a little bit unrealistic, and of course you're shooting into the sun, it's really hard to actually capture it. So a technique that you can use to try and diffuse some of that extreme contrast right around the setting sun is to use 1 or 2 radial filters using the dehaze function. So first one, I'm going to add a very small radial filter just over the sun, and I'm going to dehaze it a little bit, and that takes out some of that contrast and begins to blend the sun against the horizon. And then I'm going to add another one which is much larger across the whole of that horizon. It's maybe a little bit too big. And again, add some dehaze. And what that tends to do is it blends the setting sun into the image, and it's not as contrasty. And I think that helps the image. So the second bonus that I've got for you today is about smoothing skin. And so this is a picture I took when I was setting up a studio shoot a while ago. And as you can see, I've got a few wrinkles that have come from years of, I don't know, life or something. And a couple of lines across my forehead. Now, if I was more vain than I am, what I could do is I could take a brush tool, and if I make the clarity -100 and the sharpness plus 100, and I'll take a fairly big brush here. Ooh, not that big, about that big. And paint across my forehead, you'll see that those lines just soften a little bit. And if I do the same under my eyes and around my nose, and also this hard line here. Now, all of that doesn't look like I've done very much, but if I show you the effect when I turn it on and off, is that it makes quite a difference. It's not perfect, but it begins to just soften things up. And another thing that I tend to do with portraits is try and bring out the eyes a little bit more. And one way of doing that is just to make the whites of the eye a little bit whiter. And what you can do is take a very small radial filter, remembering to turn off the adjustment for smooth skin, and just bring up the whites a little bit. I can then duplicate it and right the way across here. And again, that just brings up the eyes a little bit. And so those are a couple of little adjustments that you might consider when you're editing portraits of families and friends. Right, back to my top 7. The fourth one that I'm going to talk about is the HSL sliders and adjusting the HSL sliders for specific colours. And in this picture of some bluebells that I took a couple of weeks ago, if I pull down the HSL slider, you can see that I can change the hue, the saturation, and all the luminescence of any of the colours in the picture. And what I tend to do is I use the luminescence set of sliders to find out what colours I have in the image. Have I got any reds? No, there's no change there. Have I got any greens? Well, clearly I've got greens. Let's see. Okay, I've got lots of greens. So for bluebells, really difficult to get the colour right. And what I tend to do here is I want to, rather than changing the hue, I just want to bring up the luminescence of the blues and a little bit of the magentas, the purples. What I tend to do is I tend to focus on luminescence rather than changing the hue of a colour or changing the saturation. Here I'm quite happy with the greens and the colours of the bluebells, but just wanted to raise the light of the bluebells to really bring them out and make them peacefully pop in this particular image. Staying with the HSL, in my fifth tip, I'm interested in using the HSL in editing black and white pictures. And in this image of Godrevy Lighthouse, I'm going to adopt a black and white profile. So I'm just going to send it to Adobe Monochrome. Takes all the colour out of the image, and you would think that then there's not very much you can do with colour. When I switch this image into monochrome, the HSL slider disappears, but you now get a black and white set of sliders, and these can be used because the colours are still there. You can still adjust the colours, particularly in luminescence. And what you can see here, let's start off with the blues because we've got a lot of blue sky. I'm going to bring the light of the blues down, and you can see straight away in this area here we're adding much more contrast into the image through the use of the blues. We've also got a bunch of yellows and oranges over here which are really pulling my eye away from where I want to people to look. So I'm going to bring those down, and really quite a long way, and it brings a bunch of detail of the clouds back into the image. have we got any purples? We've got a bit of purple, so we actually, again, we're going to bring that down a little bit. And any aquas? No aquas in the image, and I'm sure there's no red. So what I can do now is just bring up the whites and bring down the darks a little bit. And now we have a much more impactful black and white image. So use the HSL sliders that are available in a black and white profile to adjust your image to get as much out of it as possible. The sixth feature that I use a lot when I'm editing images is color grading. And you can find that in a drop down panel on the right hand side of your screen, and here you can affect the midtones, the shadows and the highlights. I tend to use just the highlights and the shadows. And here's a picture that I took when I was doing that studio shoot. And you can see that she's got great blue jumper, great red hair, and we can use that in the color grading by, I want to bring the blues in the shadows to be a stronger blue, and I want the reds in her hair to be even stronger. The color grading wheels have two parts. One, which is what is the hue, and secondly is how saturated that color is. So if I turn the color grading off, you'll see that it makes quite a difference in the overall image by what I have done. Whether an image is suitable for color grading and what you can do with that color grading really depends on the picture that you have. I don't use a lot of color grading in landscape photography because I'm trying to get pure colors there. But in studio work, and particularly if I've shot in a theatre, I use a lot of color grading to try and bring out the colors that either I see or I want to see, or to really emphasize a particular tone or color. So color grading is great. I suggest that you try it out on some of your own images. So the seventh and final item that I'm going to talk about today is using presets. And I use presets a lot, and you can see here that over the time I've created a lot of presets for particular shoots to be able to help me edit quickly. And I'm going to do a separate video about presets, but what I will show you is once you've created a preset, you can use it later when you have a similar set of light and color and shooting circumstances. This is a picture I took in the theatre a couple of years ago, and I developed a preset just for it. I call it the Nutcracker image. These presets I tend to name based on a particular shoot, and you can see that the edit that I've made previously to create this preset has worked perfectly to take this image from its raw file into something that looks much better. And I use it as a starting point. I of course adjust from the preset, but I use them to try and take the best of my editing and keep those so that I can use them again later. So that's it. 7 editing approaches that I use a lot in all of my work, and also 3 bonuses. I hope you found it useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, maybe consider subscribing, and maybe come back and have a look at videos in the future. Thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye for now.